The dust settled on the horizon like a veil being drawn across the dying sun, and Flint Caldwell watched it with the same hollow eyes he'd worn for the past 3 years. Lonesome didn't begin to describe the emptiness carved into his weathered face as he guided his horse down the main street of Shafter, Texas, a town as defeated as the man who rode into it. The summer of 1874 had been merciless, scorching everything it touched, including what remained of Flint's spirit. At 32, he'd seen enough death to last several lifetimes, first in the war between the states, then as a Texas Ranger, and finally as a drifter taking odd jobs that usually involved his steady hand and the Colt .45 that hung at his side. The gun had become more of a companion than any living soul had been for years. Flint dismounted outside the only saloon in Shafter, tying his dapple gray to the hitching post with practiced movements. The mare, Dust, was perhaps the only creature he'd spoken more than 10 words to in the past month. He patted her neck out of habit rather than affection before pushing through the batwing doors of the establishment. The interior was cool and dark, a blessed relief from the punishing Texas sun. A handful of patrons nursed drinks at scattered tables, and a piano player half-heartedly tapped out a tune in the corner. Flint made his way to the bar, his spurs jangling a melancholy rhythm against the rough-hewn floorboards. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, his voice rough from disuse. He slid a coin across the scarred wooden surface, not bothering to make eye contact. The barkeep, a portly man with a graying mustache, placed the glass before him without comment, having served enough men like Flint to recognize when words weren't welcome. Flint had just raised the glass to his lips when the saloon doors swung open again. The abrupt burst of sunlight made him squint, but it wasn't the light that caught his attention. It was a sound so foreign in this temple of quiet desperation that it seemed to come from another world entirely. Laughter. A baby's laughter, bright and bubbling like a spring creek, cutting through the stale air and the haze of tobacco smoke. Flint turned, glass still suspended halfway to his mouth, and for the first time in years, something other than indifference registered in his eyes. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright day outside. Cradled in her arms was a baby, perhaps a year old, with chubby hands reaching upward to touch the mother's face. The infant giggled again, a sound so pure that several of the hard-bitten men in the room turned to look, expressions softening despite themselves. The woman stepped fully into the saloon, and Flint could see her clearly now. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was plain but clean, and though there was weariness in the set of her shoulders, her face was alive with warmth as she gazed down at the child. "Pardon me," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern lilt as she approached the bar. "I'm looking for the owner of this establishment." The barkeep raised his hand. "That'd be me, madam, Walter Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, I'm Nora Walsh. I believe you posted an advertisement for a cook and housekeeper at your boarding house." Flint watched as the barkeep's face registered surprise, then wariness. "That I did, madam, but I wasn't expecting." His eyes flicked to the baby. "I understand your concern," she said quickly, shifting the child on her hip. The baby boy for Flint could now see it was a boy with a shock of dark hair continued to smile, revealing 2 tiny teeth in his pink gums. "But I assure you, Thomas won't be any trouble. He's a good baby and I'm a hard worker." Jenkins frowned. "The position requires full attention, Mrs. Walsh. With a little one, miss," she corrected softly, "and I'm accustomed to managing many responsibilities at once." Something in her tone made Flint study her more carefully. There was pride there and determination, but underneath it all, a note of desperation that he recognized all too well. This was a woman at the end of her rope, trying not to show it. Jenkins seemed to be wavering, but before he could respond, the baby twisted in Nora's arms, his bright eyes landing directly on Flint. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that connection, the weathered cowboy and the innocent child regarding each other across a chasm of experience. Then, to Flint's utter astonishment, the baby let out a delighted shriek and reached toward him with grabbing fingers. The gesture was so unexpected that Flint nearly dropped his whiskey. He set it down hastily, feeling heat rise to his face as every eye in the place turned toward him. "I'm sorry," Nora said, attempting to redirect the child's attention. "He's in a friendly phase, takes to strangers sometimes." Flint nodded stiffly, unable to form a response. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him with anything other than suspicion or fear. To be the object of such uncomplicated delight was disorienting. "As I was saying, Miss Walsh," Jenkins continued, "I'm not sure this arrangement would work out. Perhaps in Odessa or El Paso there might be—" "Mr. Jenkins," she interrupted, her voice firmer now. "I've traveled a very long way based on your advertisement, which mentioned nothing about excluding women with children. I cook excellent meals, keep a tidy house, and I don't mind working from dawn till dusk. All I ask is a fair chance to prove myself." The baby Thomas was still staring at Flint, his little face breaking into another smile. Flint looked away, uncomfortable with the attention, but found his eyes drawn back despite himself. Jenkins sighed heavily. "I've got 4 permanent boarders, all men working the cattle drives or at the silver mine. They pay good money for peace and quiet when they're not working. A crying baby at all hours won't sit well." "He rarely cries," Nora insisted, though her voice had begun to waver. "Please, Mr. Jenkins." "Just a trial period." Flint could see the barkeep was unmoved. Before he fully realized what he was doing, he heard his own voice break the silence. "I'll vouch for her." The words hung in the air, surprising no one more than himself. Jenkins turned to him with raised eyebrows. "You'll what, Caldwell?" Flint cleared his throat, committed now. "I said I'll vouch for her, and the boy." Nora looked at him with wide, startled eyes. "Sir, you don't even know me." "No, I don't," Flint agreed, feeling increasingly out of his depth. "But I know Jenkins here needs a cook badly enough that he's been complaining about it for 2 weeks. And I know his current boarders have been threatening to move to Mrs. Peterson's place in Willow Creek if they have to eat his biscuits one more time." A low chuckle rippled through the saloon. Jenkins's face reddened. "That's beside the point, Caldwell. I don't think it is." Flint stood, his full height just over 6 feet, giving his words additional weight. "Give the lady a week. If it doesn't work out, I'll personally see to finding her other arrangements." Nora's expression was a mixture of gratitude and wariness, as if she couldn't decide whether to thank him or question his motives. The baby, however, had no such reservations. He let out another delighted laugh and bounced in his mother's arms. Jenkins looked between them, then threw up his hands in defeat. 1 week, he conceded. "The room at the back of the boarding house, it's small, but it'll fit you and the little one." Relief washed over Nora's face. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. You won't regret it. See that I don't." Jenkins gestured toward the door. "Boarding house is 2 buildings down. I'll show you after I close up here tonight. For now, Martha at the general store can give you the key." Nora nodded, then turned her attention to Flint. "And thank you, Mr. Caldwell, Flint Caldwell." "Mr. Caldwell." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to reconcile his rough appearance with his unexpected intervention. "I don't know why you spoke up for me, but I'm grateful." Flint shifted uncomfortably, already regretting drawing attention to himself. "It was nothing." It wasn't nothing to me." Her direct gaze made him want to look away, but something kept his eyes locked with hers. "May I ask why you did it?" It was a fair question, one he wasn't sure he could answer. The truth was, he didn't know what had possessed him. Maybe it was the baby's laughter, a sound so foreign to his existence that it had momentarily cracked the shell he'd built around himself. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity in the way she held herself, despite her obvious circumstances. "Just seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally, the words inadequate even to his own ears. She nodded slowly, seeming to accept his answer even if she didn't fully believe it. The baby squirmed in her arms, still focused on Flint with fascination. "This is Thomas," she said, bouncing the child gently. "He's 10 months old and, as you can see, quite taken with you." Flint managed a tight nod in the baby's direction, unsure how to interact with such a small human. It had been so long since he'd been around children that he felt as awkward as a greenhorn on his first cattle drive. "I should let you get back to your drink," Nora said, sensing his discomfort. "And I need to get this little one settled. But truly, Mr. Caldwell, thank you." With that, she turned and made her way back toward the door, pausing only to adjust her grip on the baby, who peered over her shoulder at Flint with curious eyes until they disappeared into the bright day outside. Flint sat back down, aware of the eyes still on him. He picked up his whiskey and downed it in one swallow, hoping to douse the strange feeling that had taken root in his chest. It was uncomfortable, this sensation like something long dormant was stirring to life. "Never took you for the chivalrous type, Caldwell," Jenkins remarked, wiping down the bar. Flint didn't respond. He wasn't the chivalrous type. He wasn't any type at all anymore, just a man passing through life with as little entanglement as possible. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he just bound himself to the welfare of a woman and child he'd never laid eyes on before today. "Another," he said, sliding his empty glass toward Jenkins. As the barkeep refilled it, Flint tried to convince himself that he'd forget all about Nora Walsh and her smiling baby by morning. But as he raised the second glass to his lips, the echo of that bright, innocent laughter still rang in his ears, and he knew with unsettling certainty that something fundamental had shifted in his world. The next morning found Flint at the livery stable, where he'd taken temporary work mending tack and shoeing horses. The owner, an old-timer named Silas Parker, had hired him 3 weeks ago when Flint's funds had run low. It wasn't the first time Flint had stopped in Shafter. The town lay on a route he traversed every few years, but it was the longest he'd stayed in one place in recent memory. "You're mighty focused this morning," Silas commented as Flint worked meticulously on a broken bridle. "Something on your mind?" "No," Flint replied curtly, though it was a lie. Despite his best efforts, he'd found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Nora Walsh and her son. He tossed and turned in his rented room above the saloon, wondering what had possessed him to involve himself in their affairs. "Heard you stood up for that young woman at Jenkins' place yesterday," Silas continued, unperturbed by Flint's brevity. "That was decent of you." Flint grunted noncommittally. News traveled fast in small towns, one of the many reasons he generally avoided staying in them. "Pretty little thing, isn't she?" Silas pressed, a knowing glint in his rheumy eyes. Flint looked up sharply. "I didn't notice." Silas chuckled, the sound like leather creaking. "Course you didn't. And I suppose you didn't notice that baby of hers either. Cutest little tyke I've seen in a while. Saw them at the Mercantile this morning, getting settled in." Despite himself, Flint felt a tug of curiosity. "Jenkins gave her the job then, for a trial period, from what I gather." Silas settled onto a nearby stool, clearly ready for a chat. "Martha at the store was saying the young lady came all the way from Georgia. Widow, apparently. Husband was killed in some kind of accident last year. A widow. That explained the desperation Flint had sensed beneath her composed exterior. A woman alone with a child had few options in these parts or anywhere for that matter. Shame, Flint said, returning his attention to the bridal. But it's not my concern. No, then why'd you vouch for her? When Flint didn't answer, Silas shrugged and stood. Well, whatever your reasons, you did a good turn. God knows this town could use more kindness in it. Flint worked through midday, breaking only when Silas insisted he take time for a meal. Reluctantly, he made his way to the boarding house where he knew Jenkins served lunch to travelers and locals alike. He told himself it was simply the closest place to eat, not an opportunity to check on Nora's progress. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and simple furnishings. As Flint stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the changed atmosphere. The dining room, which had always been serviceable but uninviting, now bore small touches that transformed it. Fresh wildflowers in jars on each table, curtains pulled back to let in the sunlight, and most noticeably, the aroma of home cooking that made his stomach growl in response. Several tables were already occupied, the diners looking more content than Flint had ever seen at one of Jenkins's meals. He took a seat in the corner, his back to the wall out of long habit, and surveyed the room. A moment later, the kitchen door swung open, and Nora emerged carrying a tray loaded with plates. She wore a simple blue dress with an apron tied around her waist, her hair secured in the same neat knot as yesterday. Despite having clearly been working since dawn, she looked composed and moved with graceful efficiency as she served the waiting customers. The baby, Flint noted, was seated in a makeshift pen fashioned from chairs in the corner of the room. Thomas was contentedly playing with wooden spoons and a small stuffed horse, occasionally babbling to himself. As Flint watched, the child looked up and with uncanny awareness spotted him immediately. The baby's face lit up with a wide, gummy smile. Flint found himself nodding slightly in acknowledgement before he could stop himself. The gesture made the baby bounce excitedly, dropping his toys to reach toward Flint with grabby hands. "Well, well," came a voice beside him, "if it isn't our local guardian angel." Flint turned to find Jenkins standing there, a bemused expression on his face. The barkeep gestured to the chair across from Flint. "Mind if I join you?" Without waiting for an answer, Jenkins sat, his eyes following Flint's previous line of sight to Nora, who was now refilling a customer's coffee cup. "I have to hand it to you, Caldwell. You've got good instincts. The woman can cook like nobody's business." Had a full house for breakfast this morning and word spread. Lunch crowds twice what it usually is. Flint made a non-committal sound, uncomfortable with the implied credit. "The little one's well behaved, too," Jenkins continued. "Hardly makes a peep unless he's laughing." "Don't know what I was worried about." Before Flint could respond, Nora approached their table, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen heat. She looked surprised to see Flint but recovered quickly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said with a warm smile, "I was hoping I'd see you again to properly thank you." Flint shifted in his seat. "No need for thanks. Nevertheless, you have my gratitude." She turned to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, if you don't mind, I've prepared a special plate for Mr. Caldwell as a token of appreciation." Jenkins raised his eyebrows but nodded. "By all means. Your cooking's bringing in more business than I've had in months. I'll be right back." Nora hurried back to the kitchen, returning moments later with a heaping plate of roasted beef, potatoes with gravy, and fresh cornbread. She set it before Flint with a flourish. "It's nothing fancy, but I noticed you didn't come in for breakfast, so I thought you might appreciate a hearty lunch." The simple kindness of the gesture caught Flint off guard. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had gone out of their way to do something special for him. "Thank you," he managed, the words rusty from disuse. She beamed at him, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. "Enjoy it while it's hot," she said, then turned at the sound of Thomas beginning to fuss. "Excuse me, gentlemen. My little man is getting hungry himself." As she walked away to attend to her son, Jenkins leaned forward. "You're a lucky man, Caldwell. Most folks around here have to pay for a meal that good." Flint didn't respond, instead taking a bite of the roast beef. It was perfectly seasoned and tender enough to melt in his mouth. The potatoes were buttery, and the gravy rich with flavor. Even the cornbread, something he usually found bland and dry in most establishments, was moist and slightly sweet. Across the room, Nora had picked up Thomas and was bouncing him gently while speaking to another customer. The baby peered over her shoulder, his eyes once again finding Flint. This time, the child waved a chubby hand in what seemed like deliberate greeting. Without thinking, Flint raised his own hand in a small wave back. The simple exchange felt foreign to him. He couldn't recall the last time he'd interacted with a child, let alone one too young to speak. Yet there was something disarming about the baby's uncomplicated interest in him. "Looks like you've made a friend," Jenkins observed, following Flint's gaze. Flint returned his attention to his meal, uncomfortable with Jenkins's scrutiny. "He's just a baby, probably waves at everyone." "Actually, he's been rather particular today," Jenkins said. "Cried when old Dr. Forrester tried to hold him, and he's usually good with little ones." Flint didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. He focused on his meal instead, trying to ignore the occasional glances from both Nora and her son. When he finished eating, cleaning his plate more thoroughly than he had in recent memory, Flint stood to leave. He reached for his money clip, but Jenkins shook his head. "She insisted it's on the house for you, said it's the least she could do." Flint frowned. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity, man, it's gratitude." Jenkins stood as well. "Accept it graciously, why don't you?" Not everything in this world has to be a transaction. Reluctantly, Flint nodded. He made his way toward the door, but before he could leave, Nora intercepted him, the baby now settled on her hip. "Was everything to your liking, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her expression hopeful. "Best meal I've had in years," he admitted truthfully. "Thank you." Her face lit up at the praise. "I'm glad. It's the least I could do after your kindness yesterday." Thomas, seeming to sense he was the topic of conversation, let out a happy squeal and reached for Flint again. This time, his tiny fingers brushed against the sleeve of Flint's shirt before Nora could pull him back. "I'm sorry," she said, adjusting her grip on the squirming child. "He's been doing this all day. I think he likes your hat." Flint glanced at his worn Stetson, then back at the baby's fascinated face. On impulse, he removed the hat and held it briefly in front of Thomas, who giggled and tried to grab it. Something about the child's delight loosened a knot inside Flint's chest. "Here," he said gruffly, replacing the hat on his head. "Maybe this will help." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden horse he'd been whittling during his evenings alone. It wasn't finished, the legs were still rough, and the mane only partially carved, but it was recognizable as a horse. He offered it to Thomas, who grabbed it with surprising dexterity and immediately brought it to his mouth. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, that's very kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's nothing," he interrupted. "Just something to keep his hands busy." Nora looked at him thoughtfully, as if trying to reconcile this gesture with the taciturn man before her. "Do you have children of your own, Mr. Caldwell?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "No," he said shortly. "Never married." She must have sensed she'd touched on a sensitive topic because she quickly changed course. "Well, thank you for this." Thomas loves horses, or at least he loves pointing at them when we see them. Don't you, sweetheart? The baby babbled happily around the wooden toy, his eyes still fixed on Flint with unnerving interest. I should get back to work, Flint said, suddenly needing to escape the unfamiliar warmth of this interaction. Of course. But please come back for dinner. I'm making apple pie for dessert, Nora said, her expression open and inviting. Flint hesitated, then nodded once before heading for the door. As he stepped back into the harsh sunlight, he felt oddly disoriented, as if he'd briefly visited another world, one where simple kindnesses were exchanged and babies laughed for no reason other than pure joy. He made his way back to the livery, his thoughts in turmoil. There was something about Nora Walsh that unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Or perhaps what unsettled him was his own reaction to her and to her son. For years, he'd carefully maintained his isolation, keeping people at arm's length to avoid the pain that inevitably came with connection. Yet in the span of a day, a woman and her child had somehow slipped past his defenses without even trying. The realization made him uneasy, like discovering a door left unlocked in dangerous territory. As he picked up his tools and returned to work, Flint told himself firmly that he would not be going back for dinner. Nora Walsh had Jenkins and the other boarders to look after her now. She didn't need him complicating matters. But even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. The prospect of apple pie and the chance to see that baby smile again was already drawing him back like a beacon in the dark. True to his internal debate, Flint did not appear for dinner that evening. He worked later than necessary at the livery, then slipped into the saloon through the back entrance, taking his meal there instead. He told himself it was better this way, cleaner. He'd done his good deed, and now it was time to step back before he became entangled in their lives. But the following morning, as he walked past the boarding house on his way to work, the front door opened and Nora emerged with Thomas in her arms. She was speaking to the baby, her face animated and affectionate when she spotted Flint. Her expression brightened. "Mr. Caldwell, good morning." Flint tipped his hat, intending to keep walking, but Thomas let out an excited squeal at the sight of him, nearly lunging out of his mother's arms. "My goodness," Nora laughed, struggling to keep hold of the wriggling child. "He's certainly taken with you." Flint stopped, unable to simply walk past in the face of the baby's obvious delight. "Morning, Madam Thomas." "We missed you at dinner last night," Nora said, adjusting her grip on her son. "I saved you a slice of pie just in case." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture caught him off guard. "That was kind of you. It was the least I could do." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Jenkins mentioned you've been staying in town for a few weeks. Are you passing through, or do you have business in Shafter?" "Just passing through," Flint said, though he realized he'd been in Shafter longer than he'd initially planned. "Picked up some work at the livery until I move on." "I see." Was there disappointment in her voice, or was he imagining it? "Well, Thomas and I were just heading to the mercantile for supplies. Would you like to join us? I could use a strong pair of hands." Flint knew he should decline. Getting more involved with Nora and her son went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over the years. And yet, looking at the hopeful expression on her face and the baby's uncomplicated delight, he found himself nodding. "I've got some time before Silas expects me," he heard himself say. They walked together down the dusty main street, an unlikely trio that drew curious glances from the townsfolk. Flint was acutely aware of how they must look the rough-edged drifter alongside the young widow and her child, as if they belonged together. "So, Mr. Caldwell," Nora said as they approached the mercantile, "what brought you to Shafter in the first place?" Flint considered his answer carefully. His reasons for wandering weren't something he discussed with anyone. "Just following the work," he said finally. "Been moving around since the war ended." "The war? You fought Confederate cavalry," he said shortly. "Wasn't much of a choice where I come from." She nodded thoughtfully. "My father and brothers fought as well. My oldest brother didn't come home." Her voice held old pain, but not directed at him. "It changed everything for so many families." "That it did." Flint held the door of the mercantile open for her, grateful for the chance to change the subject. "What supplies do you need?" "Flour, sugar, coffee, and a few spices," Nora replied, shifting Thomas to her other hip. "Mr. Jenkins has given me free rein with the kitchen, and I want to try some new recipes." As they moved through the store, Flint noticed how efficiently Nora selected her items, checking prices carefully and making substitutions where necessary. She clearly knew how to manage limited resources, a skill he recognized from his own lean years. Thomas, meanwhile, continued to watch Flint with fascination, occasionally reaching out when Nora brought him close enough. After the third such attempt, Flint surprised himself by offering his finger to the baby, who promptly grabbed it with surprising strength. "He's got a good grip," Flint observed. Nora smiled. "He's strong for his age. Been that way since he was born. Must be difficult raising him on your own." Her smile faltered slightly. "It has its challenges, but he's worth every one of them." Flint hesitated, then asked the question that had been at the back of his mind. "Your husband, was he from Georgia as well?" Nora's expression grew guarded. "Yes, we married young. He worked at a lumber mill." She busied herself examining a tin of baking powder. "There was an accident." "Thomas was only 4 months old." "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were sincere. "Thank you." She met his eyes briefly, and he saw in them a resilience that matched his own, forged in different fires but tempered to the same strength. "After Frank died, there wasn't much left for us in Savannah. My parents are gone and Frank's family." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "I saw Mr. Jenkins's advertisement in a newspaper that passed through town. It seemed like Providence." Flint nodded, understanding the need to leave painful memories behind. He'd been doing the same thing for years, though he'd never managed to outrun his own ghosts. By the time they'd gathered all her supplies, Flint's arms were laden with packages. Thomas had finally succumbed to sleep against his mother's shoulder, his little hand still clutching the wooden horse Flint had given him. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Nora spoke again, her voice soft so as not to wake the baby. "I never asked what brought you to the livery." "Are you good with horses, Mr. Caldwell?" "Flint," he said, surprising himself. "You can call me Flint. And yes, I've always had a way with horses. Worked as a wrangler, trainer, sometimes a farrier. Animals make more sense than people most days." She smiled at that. "Flint, then." "And I'm Nora, please. Mrs. Walsh makes me feel like my mother-in-law." The slight joke caught him off guard, and he found the corner of his mouth lifting in what might almost be a smile. "Nora," he repeated, testing the name. They reached the boarding house, and Flint carried the supplies to the kitchen, as Nora directed. The room was warm and already bore the imprint of her presence, a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, herbs hanging to dry, a rocking chair pulled close to the stove where she could sit with Thomas while cooking. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered as he set down the last package. "It's fresh, and I've just made some cinnamon rolls." Every instinct told Flint to decline, to retreat back to the familiar safety of his solitude. But as Thomas stirred and opened his eyes, immediately seeking out Flint with a sleepy smile, he found himself nodding. That would be nice. Nora beamed, laying the still drowsy Thomas on a blanket spread in the corner before moving to pour the coffee. Flint stood awkwardly for a moment, then sat at the small table by the window. "Cream or sugar?" she asked. "Black is fine." She handed him a steaming cup, then placed a plate with a large cinnamon roll before him. The pastry was still warm, glistening with sugar and spice. "Try it," she urged. "I haven't made these since I left Georgia." Flint took a bite and couldn't suppress a sound of appreciation. The roll was perfect, soft inside with a slight crispness to the exterior, the cinnamon and sugar balanced with what might have been a hint of nutmeg. "This is outstanding," he said honestly, her face flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. Cooking has always been a comfort to me, even in the hardest times." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few moments, Flint savoring the roll while Nora sipped her own coffee. Thomas had rolled onto his stomach and was pushing himself up, apparently determined to crawl toward them. "He's getting more mobile by the day," Nora observed fondly. "Soon he'll be walking, and then I'll really have my hands full." Flint watched the baby's determined efforts with unexpected interest. "He seems like a good boy." "He is." Nora's expression softened as she looked at her son. "He's my whole world now." The simple statement carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she was fighting to build. Flint understood that kind of devotion, though it had been many years since he'd allowed himself to care so deeply about anything or anyone. Thomas finally reached Flint's boot and pulled himself to a sitting position, looking up with triumph. Before Flint could react, the baby had grabbed onto his pant leg and was attempting to pull himself to standing. "He's using you as practice furniture," Nora laughed. "I can take him if he's bothering you." "He's fine," Flint said, surprising himself again. He watched as Thomas wobbled on unsteady legs, clutching the fabric of his pants for support. The baby looked up at him with such trust and expectation that Flint found himself reaching down to steady him with a gentle hand. The moment felt significant somehow, as if some invisible barrier had been crossed. Thomas bounced happily, secure in Flint's light grip, while Nora watched them with an expression Flint couldn't quite interpret. The clock on the wall chimed 9, breaking the spell. Flint reluctantly withdrew his hand and stood. "I should get to the livery. Silas will be wondering where I am." "Of course." Nora rose as well, scooping Thomas up despite his protests. "Thank you for your help with the supplies. It was no trouble." Flint hesitated at the door, feeling as if there was something more to say but not knowing what it might be. Nora seemed to sense his uncertainty. "Will you come for dinner tonight? I promise to set aside another piece of pie." Against his better judgment, Flint nodded. "I'll be there." As he walked to the livery, Flint tried to make sense of the strange lightness in his chest. It had been so long since he'd experienced anything resembling happiness that he barely recognized the feeling. But there was no denying that the morning spent in Nora and Thomas's company had awakened something he'd thought long dead. And for the first time in years, the prospect of the day ahead felt like something more than just another series of hours to endure. Silas looked up with surprise when Flint finally arrived at the livery. "Beginning to think you weren't coming in today," the old man remarked. "Not like you to be late." "Had some business to attend to," Flint replied vaguely, hanging his hat on a peg and rolling up his sleeves. "Business, eh?" Silas's weathered face creased with a knowing smile. "Would that business happen to involve a pretty widow and her boy?" Flint shot him a warning look. "Just helped her carry some supplies from the mercantile. Mighty neighborly of you." Silas handed him a set of horseshoes. "Bay mare in the third stall needs these fitted. Owner's picking her up at noon." Grateful for the chance to focus on familiar work, Flint set about his task, letting the rhythm of it clear his mind. By midday, he'd shod the bay mare, mended 2 saddles, and mucked out several stalls. The physical labor was comforting in its predictability. unlike the confusing tangle of emotions that Nora and Thomas stirred in him. As he worked on cleaning a set of tack near the open doors of the livery, a commotion from the street caught his attention. Looking up, he saw a group of riders entering town, 5 men on trail-worn horses, their manner suggesting they'd been traveling hard. Something about the leader of the group, a tall man with a shock of red hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, triggered a distant memory in Flint's mind. He'd seen this man before, though he couldn't immediately place where. The riders dismounted outside the saloon, and Flint returned to his work, though he kept one eye on the newcomers. Shafter saw its share of drifters and cowboys passing through, especially during the cattle drive season, but something about this group put his instincts on alert. Silas ambled over, following Flint's gaze. "New faces in town," he observed. "Don't recognize any of them." Flint kept his tone neutral, though his mind was working to place that familiar face. The afternoon passed without incident, and as the workday drew to a close, Flint found himself anticipating dinner at the boarding house with unexpected eagerness. He finished his tasks, cleaned up as best he could, and was about to head out when Silas stopped him. "Got something for you," the old man said, reaching beneath the counter. He pulled out a small cloth bag and handed it to Flint. "Candy sticks, for the little one." Flint stared at the bag, caught off guard by the gesture. "What's this for?" Silas shrugged. "Just seems like that baby's brought some light back into your eyes. Figured I'd contribute to the cause." "I don't know what you're talking about," Flint said stiffly, though he accepted the bag. "Course you don't," Silas chuckled. "Just tell Nora they're from a friend if you're too stubborn to take credit." Flint left the livery with the candy in his pocket, his thoughts churning. Was it so obvious, the effect that Nora and Thomas had on him? He'd spent years cultivating a demeanor that kept people at a distance. The idea that a woman he barely knew and her infant son could so easily penetrate that barrier was unsettling. As he approached the boarding house, the sound of Thomas's laughter drifted through the open windows, clear and bright in the evening air. Despite himself, Flint felt the tension in his shoulders ease at the sound. The dining room was busier than the day before, nearly every table occupied. Flint hesitated in the doorway, suddenly conscious of his work-worn appearance among the mostly clean-looking diners. Before he could reconsider, Nora spotted him from where she was serving a table. Her face brightened immediately, and she made her way over to him. "You came," she said, as if she genuinely doubted he would. "I've saved you a seat in the corner. Thomas has been watching the door for the past hour." Sure enough, the baby was in his makeshift pen again, and at the sight of Flint, he began bouncing excitedly, his little hands reaching upward. "I'm not exactly presentable," Flint said, gesturing to his dusty clothes. "Maybe I should—" "Nonsense," Nora interrupted. "Everyone here works for a living. Besides, I saved that seat specifically because it's a bit removed from the others." She led him to a small table partially screened by a potted plant, where a single-place setting waited. As Flint sat down, she disappeared briefly into the kitchen, returning with a plate heaped with roast chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread. "Eat while it's hot," she said, setting it before him. "I'll bring Thomas over. He's been wanting to see you all day." Before Flint could protest, she had retrieved the baby and returned to his table. Thomas immediately lunged for Flint, almost toppling out of Nora's arms in his enthusiasm. "My goodness," Nora laughed, struggling to keep hold of him. "I've never seen him like this with anyone." Flint's hands were halfway raised before he realized what he was doing. He hesitated, then extended them fully. "May I?" Surprise flickered across Nora's face, but she nodded and carefully transferred Thomas to Flint's waiting arms. The weight and warmth of the child felt foreign, yet somehow right as Flint settled him on his knee. Thomas immediately reached up to pat Flint's cheek with his small hand, babbling happily as if telling him about his day. "I think he's missed you," Nora said softly. Flint found himself bouncing his knee gently, earning a delighted giggle from Thomas. "Got something for him," he said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand to extract the candy sticks. "From Sela's at the livery. Said they were for the little one." Nora's expression softened. "That was very thoughtful. Please thank him for me." She took the bag and removed one stick. "He's a bit young for these yet, but maybe just a tiny taste." She broke off a small piece and let Thomas suck on it briefly. The baby's eyes widened at the sweet flavor, and he smacked his lips appreciatively. "I think that's a success," she laughed, storing the rest away. "Now, you eat your dinner before it gets cold. I need to attend to the other tables, but I'll be back." As she moved away, Flint found himself in the novel position of trying to eat one-handed while keeping a wriggling baby secure on his knee. Thomas seemed content to stay there, occasionally reaching for Flint's plate, but mostly just watching him with those bright, curious eyes. The other diners cast occasional glances their way, some curious, others approving. Flint ignored them, focusing instead on the unexpected pleasure of sharing his meal with this small human who seemed so inexplicably drawn to him. When Nora returned some time later, she found Thomas half asleep against Flint's chest, one tiny fist clutching the collar of his shirt. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to abandon him with you for so long." "It's fine," Flint assured her, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "He's no trouble." Nora sat in the chair opposite him, her expression thoughtful. "You're good with him. Have you spent much time around children?" The question stirred memories Flint usually kept buried of a younger brother who'd looked up to him with similar trust, of promises made and broken by circumstances beyond his control. "Not recently," he said at last, "but I had siblings growing up." She seemed to sense there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, she reached for Thomas. "Let me take him now. You must be tired after working all day." As Flint carefully transferred the drowsy baby back to his mother, their hands brushed, and he felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. Nora must have felt it too, for her eyes met his with startled awareness before she quickly looked away. "I saved that pie for you," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Would you like it now, or would you prefer to take it with you?" "Now would be fine," Flint replied, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. She nodded and left to retrieve it, Thomas cradled against her shoulder. When she returned with the pie, a generous slice of golden apple filling encased in flaky crust she had composed herself. "I've been meaning to ask," she said as she placed the dessert before him. "How long do you plan to stay in Shafter?" It was a question Flint had been asking himself all day. His original plan had been to move on within a month, continuing his aimless wandering as he had for years. But now the prospect of leaving held none of its usual appeal. "Not sure," he admitted. "Depends on the work, I suppose. Sela seems to value you at the livery. It's temporary." Even as he said it, Flint wondered if it had to be. "What about you? Will you stay on with Jenkins after your trial period, if he'll have me?" Nora adjusted Thomas, who had fallen fully asleep. "It's a good situation for us. Safe, stable. Those things are precious when you have a child." Flint nodded, understanding. Safety and stability were luxuries he denied himself for years, preferring the freedom of movement that kept his ghosts at bay. But watching Nora with her son, he found himself questioning whether that freedom was worth the loneliness that accompanied it. "I should put him to bed," Nora said, rising. "Thank you for being so kind to him, to us." "It's nothing," Flint replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Well, whatever it is, it means a great deal." She hesitated, then added, "Good night, Flint." "Good night, Nora." As she carried Thomas away, Flint savored the last bites of his pie, aware that something fundamental had shifted in his world. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow not as another day to endure, but as an opportunity to see Nora and Thomas again. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it settled in his chest with surprising warmth, like embers long banked suddenly coaxed back to life. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Flint would stop by the boarding house for breakfast before work, where Thomas would greet him with increasing excitement. In the evenings, he'd return for dinner, often finding himself with the baby on his knee while Nora served the other customers. After closing, the three of them would sit in the kitchen while Nora prepared for the next day, talking quietly or sometimes just existing comfortably in each other's company. It was a domesticity Flint had never experienced, even before the war had shattered his former life. There was a simplicity to it, a rightness that both comforted and terrified him. On the fifth day, as Flint was helping Nora clean up after the dinner service, Thomas crawling contentedly around their feet, Jenkins approached with a letter in his hand. "Got some news, Miss Walsh," he said, his expression unreadable. "Just received word from a friend in Dallas. There's a position open at the Grand Hotel, their head cook with accommodations included. Pays nearly twice what I can offer you." Flint felt something cold settle in his stomach as Nora's eyes widened. "That's very generous of you to inform me, Mr. Jenkins," she said carefully. "Is there a reason you're bringing this to my attention?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I know your trial period here was just that, a trial. Thought you might want to consider something more permanent, substantial." "I see." Nora glanced at Flint, then back at Jenkins. "And would you prefer that I pursue this opportunity?" "Lord, no," Jenkins exclaimed, seeming genuinely horrified by the suggestion. "Business has doubled since you started cooking here. I'd be a fool to let you go. Just thought. Well, with the little one and all, you might want something more secure than what a small town like Shafter can offer." Nora relaxed visibly. "I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Jenkins, but I believe Thomas and I have found exactly what we need right here." Her eyes met Flint's briefly, and he saw in them a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Jenkins nodded, looking relieved. "Glad to hear it. In that case, consider your position permanent with a raise to boot. Can't have Dallas stealing my cook away." After he left, a silence fell between them. Thomas, oblivious to the tension, had crawled to Flint's feet and was pulling himself up by his pant leg again, babbling happily. "You should consider it," Flint said at last, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Dallas would have more opportunities for both of you." Nora studied him, her expression unreadable. "Is that what you think I should do, leave Shafter?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had dared voice. Flint looked down at Thomas, who was beaming up at him with complete trust, and felt a surge of something powerful and frightening. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should do what's best for you and Thomas." "And what if what's best for us is staying right here?" Her voice was steady, but Flint could see vulnerability in her eyes. Before he could respond, the front door of the boarding house burst open, and one of the ranch hands who took his meals there rushed in. "Miss Walsh, is Caldwell still here?" Flint stepped forward. "What is it, Pete?" "Trouble at the saloon," Pete said breathlessly. "That new group that rode in a few days back, they're drunk and picking fights. Silas sent me to find you, said you might be able to help calm things down before someone gets killed." Flint's mind immediately went to the red-haired man he'd been trying to place. "I'll come." He turned to Nora, who had gathered Thomas into her arms. "Stay here. Lock the doors." The concern in her eyes made something twist in his chest. "Be careful," she said softly. With a nod, Flint followed Pete out into the night, his hand instinctively checking the Colt at his side. As they hurried toward the saloon, the sounds of breaking glass and shouting grew louder. "Who are these men?" Flint asked Pete as they walked. "Don't know much," Pete replied. "Been keeping to themselves mostly, but drinking heavy." Tonight they started asking questions about local ranches. Who owns what land? When Benson from the Circle B mentioned your name, said you were working at the livery, the red-haired one got real interested. That information sent a chill down Flint's spine. If these men knew him, it likely wasn't for any good reason. The scene at the saloon was chaotic. Tables overturned, glass shattered on the floor, and in the center of it all, the 5 newcomers facing off against a group of locals. The red-haired man was holding a bottle, his expression ugly with drink and something else, something Flint recognized as malice. "Well, well," the man drawled as Flint entered. "If it ain't Flint Caldwell himself. Boys, our search is over." And suddenly Flint remembered. Wade Harmon, a deserter from the Confederate Army who turned to robbery and murder after the war. Flint had been part of a ranger group that had tracked Harmon and his gang 3 years ago, after they'd raided a settlement near Austin, killing several people including a young family. They'd caught 3 of Harmon's men, but Harmon himself and a few others had escaped, and now it seemed they'd found him. "Harmon," Flint acknowledged coldly, "didn't expect to see you in these parts. Bet you didn't." Harmon's smile was all teeth, no humor. "Been looking for you a long time, Caldwell. You and them other rangers cost me some good men." "Those men were hung for murder," Flint replied evenly. "As you would have been had you been caught." The saloon had gone quiet, the locals sensing the dangerous undercurrent to the conversation. "Well, here I am now," Harmon said, spreading his arms wide. "And here you are, all alone without your ranger friends to back you up." Flint kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. If Harmon had tracked him here, it meant trouble not just for him, but potentially for everyone in Shafter, especially those he'd grown close to. "I'm not a ranger anymore, Harmon. Haven't been for years. Whatever grudge you're holding, it's with the law, not with me." Harmon laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "That's where you're wrong, Caldwell. It's very personal." His eyes narrowed. "You killed my brother." Flint's mind flashed to the raid, to a young man who'd drawn on him despite warnings to surrender. "Your brother drew first. I gave him a chance." "And now I'm giving you one," Harmon snarled. "Meet me tomorrow at dawn outside of town. Just you and me." Or his gaze swept the saloon. "Maybe I start making everyone in this town pay for what happened." The threat hung in the air, and Flint felt a cold rage building inside him. He'd spent years running from his past, only to have it catch up to him here in the one place where he'd begun to imagine a future. "This is between you and me, Harmon," Flint said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave the town out of it. Then be there. Dawn." Harmon gestured to his men, and they began backing toward the door, keeping their guns trained on the crowd. "And Caldwell, I hear you've been spending time with a pretty widow and her baby. Be a shame if anything happened to them because you didn't show up." The threat sent ice through Flint's veins, but he kept his expression impassive until Harmon and his men had left the saloon. Only then did he allow his hands to clench into fists at his sides. "Flint," Jenkins approached cautiously. "Who the hell was that?" "Trouble," Flint replied grimly. "From a long time ago." As the saloon patrons began riding tables and sweeping up glass, Flint's mind raced. He'd known his past would catch up to him eventually. It always did. That was why he never stayed in one place for long, never allowed himself to form attachments. But he'd broken his own rules in Shafter. He'd allowed himself to care for Nora and Thomas, to imagine, however briefly, that he might have a place in their lives. And now, that decision had put them in danger. There was only one solution. He would meet Harmon as agreed, but first, he needed to make sure Nora and Thomas were safe, whatever the cost to himself. Striding out of the saloon, Flint made his way back to the boarding house, his resolve hardening with each step. The lights were still on in the kitchen, and through the window he could see Nora moving about, Thomas sleeping in a basket nearby. The sight of them, peaceful and unaware of the danger, twisted something in his chest. For a brief, selfish moment, he considered what might have been mornings at the breakfast table, evenings by the fire, Thomas growing from a baby to a boy under his watchful eye. A family, something he'd long ago convinced himself he neither deserved nor wanted. But those dreams, barely acknowledged even to himself, would have to remain just that, dreams. What mattered now was ensuring their safety. When he knocked, Nora opened the door immediately, relief washing over her face. "Thank goodness. I was worried when I heard the commotion from town." "May I come in?" Flint asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Of course." She stepped aside, studying his face with concern. "What happened?" Flint entered, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "There's trouble, Nora. Men from my past who have come looking for me." Her eyes widened. "What kind of trouble?" He hesitated, not wanting to frighten her but knowing she deserved the truth. "The dangerous kind. I was a Texas Ranger for a time after the war. These men have a grudge against me for something that happened years ago." "I see." Her voice was steady, though fear flickered in her eyes. "And they've threatened you, not just me." Flint met her gaze directly. "They know about you and Thomas. They made veiled threats." Nora's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting to the sleeping baby. "Why would they do that?" "We have nothing to do with your past. Because they've seen that eye." Flint struggled to find the words. "That I care what happens to you, both of you." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Nora's expression softened, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. "Meet their leader as he's demanded. Dawn outside of town." Flint set his hat on the table. "But first, I need to make sure you and Thomas are safe." "How?" "I've arranged for Pete to take you to the next town tonight. There's a stage leaving for San Antonio in the morning. I've put together what money I have. It's not much, but it'll get you started somewhere new." Nora stared at him, shock replacing fear. "You want us to run, to leave Shafter? It's not safe here, not while Harmon and his men are around." "Even if I face him tomorrow, there's no guarantee his gang will honor the outcome if he loses. And you expect me to just go?" Her voice had risen slightly, and she glanced at Thomas, lowering it again. "To leave everything we've built here, to leave you." The last words were barely a whisper, but they struck Flint like a physical blow. In them, he heard everything he'd been afraid to acknowledge, that what had grown between them in these few short days was more than friendship, more than kindness. It was the beginning of something he'd denied himself for too long. "I expect you to keep your son safe," he said gently. "That's all." "And what about you?" Nora stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "If this man is as dangerous as you say, facing him alone is what I've been trained to do," Flint interrupted. "I was a ranger, Nora. This isn't my first gunfight. But it could be your last." Her voice broke on the words. "And for what? A grudge from years ago." Flint reached out almost without thinking and took her hand. It was small in his, but strong like the woman herself. "For you," he said simply. "For Thomas, so you can live without looking over your shoulder." Tears welled in her eyes. "We barely know each other. I know enough." The truth of it surprised him even as he spoke. "I know that you're brave and kind, that you love your son more than anything in this world, that you make the best apple pie I've ever tasted." The corner of his mouth lifted in the ghost of a smile. And I know that meeting you and Thomas was the first good thing to happen to me in years." A tear spilled down her cheek, and he reached up to brush it away, his touch gentle. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "Not like this." "I don't want you to go," he admitted, "but I want you safe more." As if sensing the tension in the room, Thomas stirred in his basket, whimpering softly. Nora moved to him automatically, lifting him into her arms. The baby blinked sleepily, then spotted Flint and reached out with a happy gurgle. The simple gesture of trust undid him. Flint stepped closer, allowing Thomas to grab his finger as had become their custom. The baby held on tightly, as if sensing this might be the last time. "He knows you," Nora said softly. "In such a short time, you've become important to him. And he to me." Flint's voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "Which is why I need you both far from here by dawn." Nora looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a resolve that matched his own. "I have a counter-proposal," she said. "We stay, all of us. Nora, hear me out." She shifted Thomas to her hip. "You go to the sheriff, tell him about these men and their threats. Get the law involved." Flint shook his head. "Shafter's sheriff is elderly and half-blind, and Harmon has 4 men with him. It would be a bloodbath. Then send for help from the nearest ranger station. They wouldn't arrive in time, and Harmon would know I'd sent for them." Flint sighed heavily. "There's no clean way out of this, Nora. I've been running from my past for years, and now it's caught up with me. The best I can do is face it on my terms and make sure you and Thomas don't get caught in the crossfire." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if committing it to memory. "And if you win this confrontation, what then?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on ensuring their safety that he hadn't allowed himself to consider what might come after if there was an after. "I don't know," he admitted. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "Then let me give you something to think about." Nora stepped closer, until they were separated only by the baby between them. "Come back to us, Flint. Whatever happens tomorrow, find your way back to us." The words were both a plea and a promise, and they reached something deep inside him that had been dormant for too long. Carefully, mindful of Thomas still watching them with wide eyes, Flint leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a question and an answer all at once. Nora's free hand came up to rest against his cheek, and for a moment the world outside with all its dangers ceased to exist. There was only the woman before him, the child between them, and the fragile hope of a future he'd never dared imagine. When they finally parted, Flint rested his forehead against hers. "I can't ask you to wait," he whispered. "You didn't ask," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm offering. Come back to us, Flint Caldwell. That's all I ask." Thomas chose that moment to pat Flint's cheek insistently, as if adding his own demand to his mother's. Despite everything, Flint found himself smiling a real smile, perhaps the first in years. "Seems I don't have much choice," he said softly. "Not when I have 2 Walshes to answer to." The night passed too quickly. Though Flint tried repeatedly to convince Nora to leave with Pete as he'd arranged, she remained adamant. They would stay in Shafter, she insisted, and have faith in his ability to end the threat Harmon posed. In the end, he relented, though he insisted she and Thomas stay with Jenkins and his wife in their quarters above the saloon, which were more secure than the boarding house. Jenkins, upon learning of the situation, had readily agreed, his concern for Nora and the baby overriding any inconvenience. As dawn approached, Flint prepared to leave. He had cleaned his Colt methodically, checked and rechecked the action, and now stood in Jenkins's small sitting room, hat in hand. Nora waited by the door, Thomas still sleeping in the makeshift bed they'd created for him. She looked pale but composed, her strength evident in the set of her shoulders. I still think you should have gone with Pete, Flint said softly. And I still think running isn't the answer. She stepped closer, straightening the collar of his shirt with hands that trembled only slightly. Besides, Thomas would never forgive me if we left without saying goodbye, and neither would I. Flint caught her hands in his. This isn't goodbye, he promised. Just until later, she managed to smile at that. Until later, then. He kissed her once more, briefly but with all the feeling he couldn't put into words, then turned to where Thomas lay sleeping. Carefully, trying not to wake him, Flint placed his wooden horse beside the baby. To remember me by, he said quietly, if things don't go as planned. They will, Nora insisted. They must. With a final nod, Flint placed his hat on his head and left, the weight of her gaze following him down the stairs and out into the gray light of early morning. The street was deserted as he made his way toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the open plains beyond. In the distance, he could make out several figures waiting Harmon and his men, silhouetted against the lightening sky. As he approached, Flint emptied his mind of everything except the task at hand. He thought of his ranger training, of the countless confrontations he'd survived, of the skills that had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. He was no longer the drifter who had ridden into Shafter weeks ago, purposeless and hollow. Now he had someone to fight for. Harmon stepped forward as Flint reached them, a smirk playing on his scarred face. Wasn't sure you'd show, Caldwell. I gave my word, Flint replied evenly. Just you and me, Harmon. That was the agreement. Indeed it was. Harmon gestured to his men, who spread out in a semicircle, hands hovering near their weapons. They're just here to ensure fair play. Nothing about you has ever been fair, Harmon. The outlaw laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet morning. Perhaps not, but I am a man of certain principles, one of them being that debts must be paid. His face hardened. You killed my brother. In self-defense, Flint maintained. He was given the chance to surrender. Sam was 17 years old enough to ride with killers, old enough to draw on a ranger. Flint's voice was steady. I gave him a chance, which is more than you gave the family you murdered near Austin. Harmon's eyes narrowed. Ancient history, Caldwell. Today is about you and me. Then let's get to it. They faced each other across 20 paces of hard-packed dirt, the rising sun at Harmon's back, a tactical choice that put Flint at a disadvantage with the light in his eyes. But Flint had expected as much, and had positioned himself slightly angled to reduce the effect. On three, Harmon suggested, his hand hovering near his holster. Flint nodded once, his own hand relaxed at his side. He took a deep breath, letting calmness wash over him. In his mind, he saw Nora's face, heard Thomas's laughter. Come back to us, she had asked, and he intended to. One, Harmon called, his voice carrying in the still morning air. Flint flexed his fingers slightly, preparing. Two. He drew a steady breath, time seeming to slow around him, but before Harmon could call three, the sound of hoofbeats broke the tension. Both men turned to see a group of riders approaching fast from the east, at least 10 of them, the morning sun glinting off badges pinned to their chests. Rangers. Harmon cursed viciously, his hand going to his gun. You called for backup. You lying. I didn't, Flint interrupted, genuinely surprised by the ranger's appearance. But even as he spoke, understanding dawned. Jenkins must have sent for them days ago when your group first arrived in town. The approaching rangers slowed, their leader calling out, Wade Harmon. You and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons. Harmon's face contorted with rage and desperation. For a terrible moment, Flint thought he would draw anyway, forcing a firefight that would likely end with blood soaking the ground. But then, surprisingly, Harmon's shoulders sagged. Another day, Caldwell, he said, his voice low and menacing as he slowly raised his hands. This isn't over between us. "It is for now," Flint replied, relief washing through him even as he maintained his guard. The Rangers closed in, efficiently disarming Harmon and his men. Their captain, a grizzled veteran named Hollister whom Flint recognized from his own Ranger days, approached with a nod of greeting. "Caldwell, been a while." "Captain Hollister, your timing is impeccable," Hollister grunted. "Got a telegraph from the saloon keeper here 3 days ago. Said a group of rough types had ridden in, asking questions about a former Ranger. Figured it might be Harmon's gang. We've been tracking them since they hit a bank in Amarillo last month." As the Rangers secured their prisoners, Flint glanced back toward town. In the distance, he could make out figures watching from the edge of Shafter, one of them unmistakably Nora, with Thomas in her arms. "You planning to ride with us, Caldwell?" Hollister asked, noticing the direction of his gaze. "Could use a man of your experience." Flint considered the offer for a moment. Once, the idea of returning to the Rangers would have appealed to him, the structure, the purpose, the familiar camaraderie. But now, looking toward the woman and child waiting for him, he knew his path lay elsewhere. "I appreciate the offer, Captain," he said sincerely, "but I think I've found where I belong." Hollister followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "Settled down, have you? Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Flint admitted with a faint smile. "Life has a way of surprising you." After giving his statement to Hollister and ensuring that Harmon and his men were securely in custody, Flint walked back toward town. With each step, the weight that had burdened him for years seemed to lift a little more. As he drew closer, Nora handed Thomas to Jenkins and ran to meet him, her face alight with relief and something that made his heart swell in his chest. Without a word, she threw herself into his arms, holding him tightly as if afraid he might disappear. Flint held her just as fiercely, burying his face in her hair and breathing in the scent of her lavender and kitchen spices and home. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I promised I would." She pulled back slightly to look at his face, her eyes searching for any sign of injury. "What happened?" "Those men on horseback, Rangers," Flint explained. "Jenkins sent for them days ago, apparently. Harmon and his men are in custody. They won't bother us again." "Us," she repeated, her smile brightening. "I like the sound of that." Before Flint could respond, Jenkins approached with Thomas squirming excitedly in his arms. At the sight of Flint, the baby let out a delighted shriek and nearly launched himself from Jenkins's grip. Laughing, Flint took the baby, who immediately patted his face with both hands as if checking that he was real. The simple, unconditional affection of the child filled Flint with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little man," he said softly. "Did you miss me?" Thomas responded with excited babbling, his tiny fingers clutching at Flint's shirt collar. Nora watched them, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He knew you'd come back," she said. "He never doubted it for a moment." Jenkins cleared his throat, looking both awkward and pleased. "Well, I'll leave you folks to your reunion. Miss Walsh, take the day off. I can manage breakfast service this once." As Jenkins headed back toward the boarding house, Flint shifted Thomas to one arm and offered his free hand to Nora. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lacing with his. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft with hope and uncertainty. Flint looked at her, then at Thomas, who was contentedly playing with a button on his shirt. For the first time in years, the future didn't loom before him as an empty road to nowhere. Instead, it stretched out bright with possibility. "Now," he said, "we begin." A month passed, and Shafter settled back into its usual rhythms. The excitement of the Rangers' arrival and the capture of Harmon's gang had given the townsfolk something to talk about for weeks. But eventually, New gossip took its place, primarily the blossoming relationship between the quiet cowboy from the livery and the pretty widow who cooked at Jenkins's boarding house. Flint had moved from his room above the saloon to a small house on the edge of town, a two-room cabin with a front porch and a view of the distant hills. Silas had arranged it, knowing the owner was looking to sell before moving to California. The price had been fair, the location ideal, and with some work, Flint had made it comfortable for a family. Though Nora and Thomas still lived at the boarding house, they spent most evenings at the cabin, helping Flint turn it into a home. Nora had sewn curtains for the windows and brought plants to brighten the porch. Thomas had his own corner in the main room, filled with toys Flint had carved for him, and a small rocking chair Silas had contributed. On this particular evening, as summer gave way to fall, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Thomas was asleep in Flint's arms, exhausted from an afternoon of helping Flint build a fence around the small yard. "He adores you," Nora said softly, watching them from her rocking chair. "I've never seen him take to anyone the way he has to you." Flint looked down at the sleeping child, marveling at the trust implied in the way Thomas had curled against his chest. "The feeling is mutual," he admitted. "He's a remarkable boy." "Like his father," Nora said, then hesitated. "Frank was a good man, Flint, but he wasn't. He wasn't as natural with Thomas as you are. He tried, but he was always a bit afraid of doing something wrong." It was the first time she'd spoken in detail about her late husband. Flint listened carefully, understanding the significance of her sharing this part of her past. "It's different with you," she continued. "From that first day when he reached for you in the saloon, there was a connection, as if he recognized something in you that the rest of us couldn't see." "Children see clearly," Flint replied, thinking of his own childhood, of the instinctive way he'd known which adults could be trusted and which could not. "They haven't learned to doubt their instincts yet." Nora nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the sun was sinking in a blaze of gold and crimson. "I've been thinking," she said after a pause, "about the future, about us." Flint felt his heart rate increase slightly. Though they had acknowledged their feelings for each other, they had taken things slowly, both aware of the significance of building a life together, especially with Thomas to consider. "What about us?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the sudden nervousness he felt. Nora turned to face him, her expression serious yet warm. "Jenkins has offered me part ownership of the boarding house. He's getting older and he wants to step back from the day-to-day management. It would mean security for Thomas and me, a steady income." "That's wonderful," Flint said sincerely. "You deserve the recognition. You've transformed that place." "There's more," she continued. "Silas mentioned that he's looking to retire next spring. He asked if you might be interested in taking over the livery." This was news to Flint. "He hasn't said anything to me. He wanted me to broach the subject. I think he was afraid you might turn him down outright if he asked directly." She smiled slightly. "He seems to think you have a tendency to avoid putting down roots." Flint chuckled softly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "He's not wrong. At least he wasn't. And now," he met her gaze directly, "now I find I like the idea of roots, of belonging somewhere, to someone." Nora's smile deepened. "I was hoping you'd say that." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object which she held out to him. "Because I had something else in mind as well." Flint shifted Thomas carefully to look at what she was offering. In her palm lay a simple gold band, a man's wedding ring. "It was Frank's," she explained softly. "I've kept it all this time, not knowing what to do with it, but now I know." She took a deep breath. "I'd like you to have it melted down, reshaped into something new, for us." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Flint. She was offering not just a future together, but an acknowledgement of their shared past, her grief, his wandering, both now transformed into something hopeful. "Nora," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Flint Caldwell," she said, her eyes shining in the fading light. "If you'll be a father to Thomas, a husband to me, if you'll build a life with us here in Shafter." For a moment, he couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the hollow, joyless drifter who had ridden into town to the man, he was now a man capable of love, of hope, of imagining a future bright with possibility. "Yes," he said finally, the word carrying the weight of all he felt. "Yes to all of it." Nora's smile was radiant as she leaned over to kiss him, careful not to disturb Thomas. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I never expected this," she whispered. "When I came to Shafter, I was just looking for safety, for a way to provide for my son. I never imagined I'd find love again." "Neither did I," Flint admitted. "I'd convinced myself I didn't need it, didn't want it. And then you walked into that saloon with Thomas laughing in your arms, and everything changed." As if hearing his name, Thomas stirred slightly in his sleep, his small hand clutching Flint's shirt. The simple, trusting gesture filled Flint's heart to overflowing. "When?" he asked, nodding toward the ring still in Nora's palm. "When would you like to marry?" "Soon," she replied without hesitation, "before winter sets in. Just a small ceremony. Jenkins has offered to host it at the boarding house." "Whatever you want," Flint said, meaning it completely. After years of solitude, the idea of building a life with Nora and Thomas filled him with a contentment he had never thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, stars emerging one by one in the vast Texas night. Tomorrow would bring preparations for their future discussions with Silas about the livery, with Jenkins about the boarding house, with the local minister about the wedding. But for now, in this moment, there was just this: the woman he loved, the child who had claimed his heart, and the quiet certainty that he had finally found his way home. 2 months later, on a crisp November morning, Flint stood in the small church in Shafter, watching as Nora walked toward him, radiant in a simple white dress with blue ribbons. Thomas, now almost a year old, was perched on Silas's knee in the front pew, dressed in a tiny suit that matched Flint's own. As Nora reached him, taking his hands in hers, Flint marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From strangers to family in the span of a few short months, their lives intertwined as if they had always been meant to find each other. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice filling the small church where it seemed all of Shafter had gathered to witness their union. Flint barely heard the words, lost in Nora's eyes, in the promise of the life they would build together. When it came time to speak their vows, his voice was steady and sure, carrying the weight of his commitment to her and to Thomas. "I, Flint Caldwell, take thee, Nora Walsh, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Nora's voice was equally firm as she repeated the vows, her eyes never leaving his. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise, a beginning. Thomas, apparently sensing the significance of the moment, let out a delighted laugh that echoed through the church, causing ripples of affectionate laughter among the guests. Flint broke from the kiss to smile at the child, his son, now in every way that mattered. The celebration that followed at the boarding house was warm and joyful, with food Nora had prepared in advance and music provided by local musicians. Thomas was passed from arm to arm, though he frequently reached for Flint, who found himself holding the boy through much of the festivities. As evening approached, Jenkins clinked a glass for attention. "A toast," he called, raising his drink. "To Flint and Nora Caldwell, who have reminded an old cynic like me that it's never too late for new beginnings. And to young Thomas, who had the good sense to recognize a fine man when he saw one, even before the rest of us did." Cheers and laughter followed the toast, and Flint found himself surrounded by people he now considered friends: Silas, Jenkins and his wife, the other regulars from the boarding house, townspeople who had come to respect the quiet competence he brought to his work at the livery. "Happy?" Nora asked softly, appearing at his side with a sleeping Thomas in her arms. Flint looked at her, his wife, and the child they would raise together, and felt a completeness he had never known before. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied honestly. Later that night, after the guests had departed and they had returned to their cabin, their home, Flint stood on the porch looking up at the star-filled sky. Behind him, through the window, he could see Nora putting Thomas to bed in the small room they had prepared for him, singing softly as she did. The scene filled him with a profound gratitude. For years, he had wandered, a man haunted by his past and afraid to hope for a future. But life, in its mysterious way, had led him to Shafter, to a saloon on a dusty afternoon, to a moment when a baby's laughter had cracked open the shell around his heart. As he watched, Nora finished tucking Thomas in and came to join him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. Together, they looked out at the land that stretched before them, at the life they would build day by day, season by season, year by year. "What are you thinking?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Flint considered the question, then answered with the simple truth. "That for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Nora squeezed his hand, her wedding ring newly forged from the gold of her first marriage, but shaped into a design unique to them, catching the moonlight. "Welcome home, Flint Caldwell." And as they stood together under the vast Texas sky, Flint knew that the restless wandering that had defined his life was finally over. In its place was something infinitely more precious: a family, a purpose, and a joy he had never thought possible. The cowboy, who had once been a stranger to joy, had found it at last, in the arms of a woman and the laughter of a child who had claimed his heart as their own. 5 years later, Flint stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Thomas, now a sturdy 6-year-old with his mother's smile and a confidence born of being deeply loved, taught his 3-year-old sister, Emma, how to rope a wooden post. The little girl's face was scrunched in concentration, her dark curls bouncing as she tried to mimic her big brother's technique. "Easy, Emma," Thomas instructed with the patience Flint had instilled in him. "Just like Pa showed us. Let the rope do the work." The sight of them together filled Flint's heart with a quiet pride. Though Thomas was not his by blood, the bond between them was as real and deep as any father and son could share. From the moment Flint had adopted him officially after the wedding, Thomas had been his boy in every way that mattered. And Emma, born 2 years after they married, had her father wrapped firmly around her tiny finger from the moment she'd first opened her eyes and fixed them on his face with the same direct gaze Thomas had once given him in a saloon long ago. "They're getting good," Nora said, coming to stand beside him with their newest addition, 8-month-old James, nestled in her arms. The baby was dozing, his cheek pressed against his mother's shoulder, one small hand clutching her dress. "Thomas is a natural teacher," Flint replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "Gets that from you." Nora leaned into him, her body fitting against his with the familiar comfort of years spent together. "I'd say he gets his patience from his father. You're the one who sits for hours teaching him to whittle, to track, to ride." Flint smiled, still sometimes amazed by how easily she referred to him as Thomas's father, how completely they had become a family. He makes it easy. Both of them do. The livery had flourished under Flint's management, expanding to include a small horse breeding operation that was gaining recognition throughout the county. Nora, meanwhile, had transformed the boarding house into Shafter's premier establishment, adding rooms and hiring staff to meet the growing demand as the town prospered. Their life together had not been without challenges. There had been a drought 2 years back that had tested every rancher and business in the area. There had been the time Emma had fallen ill with fever, leaving them sleepless for days as they tended to her. And occasionally, nightmares from Flint's past would still surface, leaving him restless and haunted until Nora's gentle presence brought him back to the present. But through it all, they had faced each day together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome, each joy shared. "Pa! Pa, look!" Thomas called excitedly. Emma did it. Sure enough, the little girl had managed to loop her small rope around the post, her face lighting up with triumph. "I did it! Pa, Mama, I did it!" "Well done, sweetheart," Flint called back, his heart swelling at the pride in her voice. "Your brother's a good teacher." Emma beamed at Thomas, who was standing tall with his hands on his hips, every inch the proud older sibling. The bond between them was strong and affectionate, despite the age difference and lack of blood relation. "She learns fast," Thomas replied with a grin that revealed a missing front tooth lost the previous week, and solemnly placed under his pillow, for the tradition Nora had introduced to their household. As the children returned to their practice, Nora shifted James to her other shoulder, the baby stirring slightly before settling back to sleep. "Jenkins asked again about expanding the boarding house kitchen," she said. "With the railroad coming through next year, he thinks we'll see even more travelers." "What do you think?" Flint asked, knowing she would have already considered all angles of the proposition. "I think it's a good investment," she replied thoughtfully. "But it would mean hiring another cook to help with the increased workload. I don't want to be away from the children more than I already am." Flint nodded understanding. Though their businesses kept them both busy, they had made a commitment when Emma was born to ensure that one of them was always available for the children. It sometimes meant Flint handling the morning livery duties, while Nora prepared breakfast at the boarding house, then trading places so she could be home when Thomas returned from the small school that had opened in Shafter 3 years ago. "We'll make it work," he assured her. "We always do." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where a familiar figure was riding toward their home. Captain Hollister, now retired from the Rangers but still commanding respect wherever he went, visited Shafter several times a year, always making a point to stop at the Caldwell home. "Uncle Jack!" Thomas shouted, dropping his rope and running toward the gate, Emma following as fast as her little legs could carry her. Hollister dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, catching Emma as she launched herself at him and swinging her high while Thomas danced around them excitedly. "Look at you two," the former ranger said with a gruff affection that belied his tough exterior. "Growing like weeds. You've been practicing your roping like I showed you." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied earnestly. "Emma just caught her first post, did she now?" Hollister set the little girl down and knelt to her level. "That's mighty impressive, Miss Emma. You'll be out ropping your brother before long." Emma giggled, her shyness forgotten in her excitement. "Thomas is teaching me, but Pa showed us first." "Your pa's one of the best I ever saw with a rope," Hollister said, rising to his feet as Flint and Nora approached. "Though he's even better with a gun, which hopefully you two won't need to learn anytime soon." Flint shook the older man's hand warmly. "Jack, Good to see you. We weren't expecting you until next month." "Change of plans," Hollister replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he nodded to Nora. "Madam, that new one's growing fast." Nora smiled, adjusting James, who was now awake and regarding the visitor with solemn curiosity. "Would you like to hold him? He's much less squirmy than the last time you visited." To anyone who didn't know him, the idea of the formidable ex-ranger holding an infant might have seemed incongruous. But Hollister had become a fixture in their lives over the years, a surrogate uncle to the children and a link to the part of Flint's past that he was still proud of. "Maybe after I've washed up," Hollister said, though his expression softened as James gave him a gummy smile. "Got some news that couldn't wait. Thought you'd want to hear it directly from me." Something in his tone made Flint straighten, instinctively moving closer to Nora and the baby. "What kind of news?" Hollister glanced at the children, who were watching the adults with interest. "Perhaps the little ones might like to check on my horse. I brought something in my saddlebag that might be for them." Thomas immediately took the hint, grabbing Emma's hand. "Come on, Em. Let's see what Uncle Jack brought us." As the children raced toward Hollister's tethered horse, the former ranger turned back to Flint and Nora, his expression serious. "Wade Harmon is dead," he said without preamble. "Tried to escape during a transfer between prisons. Was shot by the guards." The name sent a chill through Flint, despite the years that had passed. Though Harmon had been securely imprisoned since that day outside Shafter, the threat he represented had never fully faded from Flint's mind. "You're certain?" he asked, feeling Nora's hand slip into his. Hollister nodded grimly. "Saw the body myself. Wanted to be sure before I brought you the news." A weight Flint hadn't realized he still carried seemed to lift from his shoulders. Though he had built a life of happiness and purpose in the years since confronting Harmon, there had always been a small, vigilant part of him that remained on guard against the outlaw's sworn vengeance. "Thank you for coming all this way to tell us," Nora said softly, understanding the significance of the news. "Figured you'd sleep better knowing for certain," Hollister replied. "Both of you." Flint nodded, gratitude filling him for this man who had once been his commanding officer and was now a trusted friend. "We appreciate it, Jack." From the direction of the horse came excited squeals as the children discovered whatever gifts Hollister had brought them. The sound pulled Flint back to the present, to the life that had flourished in the shadow of past dangers. "Will you stay for dinner?" Nora asked Hollister. "I'm making Thomas's favorite chicken and dumplings." "Wouldn't miss it," the former ranger replied with a smile. "Though I reckon I should help those young uns with whatever mischief they're getting into first." As Hollister moved to join the children, Nora turned to Flint, her eyes searching his face. "Are you all right?" Flint looked at her, this woman who had changed his life with her courage and her love, then at their children, at the home they had built together. The news of Harmon's death had closed a chapter from his past, but it was the present that filled his heart. "I'm more than all right," he said, drawing her and James close. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Later that evening, after a meal filled with laughter and stories, after the children had been tucked into bed with Hollister's gifts, a wooden flute for Thomas, and a small leather pouch of colored stones for Emma, Flint and Nora sat on the porch swing, watching as the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky. James was sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, and the soft sounds of the night surrounded them, crickets singing, a distant coyote calling to its pack, the gentle creak of the swing as they rocked. "I was thinking," Nora said, her head resting against Flint's shoulder, "about that first day in the saloon. Do you remember what Thomas was doing when we walked in?" Flint smiled at the memory. "He was laughing, the happiest sound I'd ever heard." "He was," Nora confirmed. "And do you know why?" "I always assumed he was just a happy baby." He was. Nora looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. But that particular laugh, the one that made everyone in the saloon turn and look, was because he had spotted you the moment we walked in, before I even saw you. He was laughing because something about you delighted him. Flint felt a tightness in his throat at the revelation. How did you know? I didn't then. But later, after we got to know each other, I realized it was the same laugh he reserved just for you. As if he recognized you somehow, even before I did. The idea that Thomas had chosen him from that very first moment was deeply moving. Flint had always believed it was chance that had brought Nora and Thomas into his life, but perhaps there had been something more at work, some connection that transcended rational explanation. "Children see things adults miss," he said softly, echoing his words from years ago. "They trust their instincts," and his instincts led him straight to you. Nora reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that were now more from laughter than hardship. Just as mine did. Flint turned to press a kiss into her palm, overwhelmed by the blessing that was his life. From the solitary, joy-starved man he had once been to the husband and father he now was, it was a transformation he could never have imagined before Nora walked into that saloon with Thomas laughing in her arms. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the depth of all he felt. "And I love you," she replied. "Always." As they sat together beneath the stars, surrounded by the home and family they had built, Flint Caldwell knew with absolute certainty that he had found the rarest treasure of all, not gold or silver or land, but love. The kind of love that heals old wounds, that builds new dreams, that transforms a life once defined by loneliness into one overflowing with joy. And it had all begun with a baby's laughter and a mother's courage, with a chance encounter that had changed everything. For a man who had once been a stranger to joy, Flint Caldwell had found it in abundance in the arms of his wife, in the laughter of his children, in the life they shared together in this small corner of the vast Texas frontier. And he would be grateful for that blessing every day for the rest of his life.